Well, I'll speak for everyone and say I really, really appreciate you taking us to that moment 12 years ago and then bringing such depth of understanding. Our next presenter is Brian Becker, who's the director of the Answer Coalition. And in fact, Answer is coordinating the march, the rally in front of the White House tomorrow, and the march through Chinatown, through the streets to the Capitol. So we're glad to have Brian.
Thanks, Debra, and thanks everyone for being here, and I hope we will see you tomorrow. The demonstration will begin promptly at noon in front of the White House. Come early to help set up. There will be signs and other things that we have to do to get ready for the activity, so it'll be right in front of the White House, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Be on time. Thank you. I think that what Raid presented and what Bill presented in terms of how the United States policy, its intervention, fragmented Iraq, created the space for Iraq, did the same in Libya, did the same in Syria. I think they covered that. So I'm gonna focus on something else, which helps us focus both on what the U.S. policy is, and also what is it that we can do. Because, you know, the mantra for people who are activists is that what we do at the grassroots really makes a difference, and yet I think a lot of people feel, well, we wished it made a difference, but it doesn't really make a difference. That the powers that be are too great, the forces of the state are too omnipotent, the resources for endless violence in the Middle East and elsewhere are so great that the movement as it exists does not measure up, does not have the resources. And even in 2002 and 2003, when we were marching month after month after month, where we had literally hundreds of thousands and 500,000 in January and another 500,000 in one particular city and millions more in thousands of cities, that in itself does not and did not stop the Iraq war. And a lot of people said, well, what did it do? Yes, it was great. There was so much energy. The New York Times saw in the demonstrations what they characterized as the second world superpower, meaning a grassroots movement. But ultimately, that movement couldn't stop the momentum towards war. And that had a very, I'd say, demoralizing impact on a lot of people. And it took a while for the ebb after that period to build up again where we could sustain a new level of strength. And that happens to all mass movements. So I want to address that question right now, because it appears to us that public opinion, unlike 2003, is largely passive at the very moment that President Obama has said that there will be endless war. I mean, they're predicting the long war, the war for generations to come. In other words, the exact policy articulated by Dick Cheney and George W. Bush, which was denounced and condemned by vast parts of progressive humanity in the United States. Here you have President Obama, not Dick Cheney, certainly. He's not George W. Bush. He's not a Democrat. He's not a Republican. He's a Democrat. All of these apparent differences, and yet announcing endless war, and yet the movement isn't responding in exactly the same way. So again, that could have the impact on us. And this is what's important, I think, for us, because we are organizers, and what we think and what we feel and what we do makes a big difference. If we have become convinced of our own ineffectiveness, if we have become convinced that all we're really doing is sort of giving witness or bearing witness, but not able to really affect policy, that will impact us, and it'll impact the influence that we have with others. So I want to roll the clock back just a little ways to see something exceptional that happened, and it happened really because of the movement, and it should be understood and included in our calculations as we go forward about this new anti-war movement and this new phase of the anti-war movement. In mid-August 2013, John Kerry said, Assad had crossed the red line. the red line that President Obama proclaimed, thinking that Assad would never cross it because then he would undoubtedly lose a war he was winning by inviting foreign intervention. The only thing that could possibly have defeated the Assad government. So President Obama, reluctant to go to war against Syria, said, well, we'll go to war if they cross the red line and use chemical weapons, thinking, of course, Assad would never do that under those circumstances. But John Kerry said, they've crossed the red line. And the chorus began for the bombing of Syria. John Kerry had like a small tactical problem when he unveiled this plan, which got, of course, the support from the neoconservative Washington Post and most of the media, and the chorus built up, Assad must go, and it looked like the U.S. was ready to strike. And once the United States government says a red line has been crossed and the dictator must go and we're going to use military action, they never stopped. They never pulled back. But the tactical problem was that it was on the eve of August 24th, which was the 50th anniversary commemoration of the March in Washington, Dr. King. Even though it was August 28th, they were commemorating it on August 24th. So President Obama couldn't exactly go and be like the reincarnation of Martin Luther King 50 years later, while on the same day announcing the bombing of Syria. So things slowed down for a couple days. And during that time, the grassroots movement in the United Kingdom, in Great Britain, had the effect that was unlike anything else that had happened in England in 200 years, which was the House of Commons voted no to the dictates of the Prime Minister about authorization for a foreign policy edict. And Cameron and the UK said, we're pulling out and Obama will have to do it by himself. And at that time, people were demonstrating now all over the United States. Congress was getting calls 300 and 400 to 1 against the authorization of bombing. President Obama was caught in the middle of this situation where he had said it was a red line and it could not be crossed without action being taken. But meanwhile, the United States no longer even had the pretext of the coalition of the willing, so-called, the bribed and coerced. UK had pulled out. And, on August 31st, we were all in front of the White House, just like we'll be tomorrow. And we were in front of the White House, we were chanting, no war against Syria. The reason we were there is President Obama was sitting in the Oval Office preparing to go to a press conference in the Rose Garden, an outdoor press conference. Very bad mistake, given the fact that there was a very loud anti-war demonstration outside. And so we were demonstrating from noon, and we were scheduled to go for several hours, and at 1 o'clock, President Obama was supposed to come out. And he didn't come out. And then it was 1:05, 1:10, 1:15. And the media, which was sitting in the Rose Garden, within earshot of our chants, no war against Syria, no war against Syria, started to tweet, we're here waiting for the president to make his decision on Syria, but all we're hearing through the White House live feed is the chant, no war against Syria. I mean, what a congruence of circumstances. That at the very moment that the president is obviously vacillating, uncertain about whether it could go, aware that if he were to strike Syria, and by the way, there was no mention then of the so-called Islamic State, that was just 16 months ago. Where were they? Why weren't they? Well, there was no, we were going to go bomb the Islamic State. No, this was to bomb the government and the army that was fighting the Islamic State. There was no mention of the Islamic State whatsoever. But here's Obama, vacillating as normal, being drawn and pulled by the right wing, the militarist forces, as usual. But the Congress is running against him, the grassroots is running against him, Britain separates. He's sitting there, and the only thing coming through the media live feed is no war against Syria, no war against Syria. I mean, it was just one of those odd moments. And finally, after 45 minutes, Obama came and said, let Congress decide. Knowing for sure that Congress would not authorize the bombing of Syria. Russia gave them a face-saving measure to get out by saying, okay, Assad has agreed to give up his chemical weapons, turn them over to international inspectors, then they can be destroyed. Obama could say, yeah, look, we got something, we got rid of Syria's chemical weapons. And the bombing of Syria did not happen. And then what happened? 2 months later, by the way, if they had been bombing Syria, what would have happened? Let's just think about what would have happened. Iran is the principal ally of Syria. Could Iran just stay on the sidelines when the government that it's defending in Syria is being now bombed by the United States with the encouragement of Israel? Isn't it likely that Iran would be compelled to carry out some reciprocal action against? If that were to happen, instead of having a bombing war in Syria, there could have been a regional war, a catastrophic war. It certainly could have included and would have included Iran. It probably would have included Lebanon. It may have included Israel. But instead, in November 2013, 7 weeks after this near war was stopped, the United States government announced nuclear negotiations with Iran and the beginning of an attempt to have some sort of settlement with Iran, which would undoubtedly lead to a normalization of relations with Iran if the nuclear settlement agreement were to take place. Of course, Netanyahu, the Republicans, and others are trying to make sure that doesn't happen, but that would be the logic of what will happen and would happen, and none of that would have been possible if the bombing war in Syria had started in September 2013. It only stopped, brothers and sisters, because of a congruence of factors, including hesitation at the top, uncertainty by Obama, uncertainty by some sectors of the Pentagon, but also because there was an international grassroots movement of opposition, and if that movement hadn't existed, that war would have started. That war would have definitely started. And if you want to talk about how can we stop Islamic State, well, certainly stopping the bombing war of Syria at that moment certainly was a blow to the Islamic State, because the bombing war at that time could have only helped the Islamic State, which was by then the principal armed rival of the Assad government. So I'm making the point that even though it seems that our resources are meager in compared to the perpetuators of war and the institutions of war, we actually do have power, but we only have power under certain circumstances. Not all circumstances. Millions could not stop the Iraq War in 2003 because Bush and Cheney had the go-ahead, the acquiescence of the Democratic Party establishment and most of the capitalist establishment to carry out the reckless destruction of Iraq. Whether it was by plan or by a virtue of plan and unintended consequences, we could discuss that. But I would say, certainly, they got away with it because they assumed that after a few weeks, the Iraqi government was in such a weakened condition, and the country had been so weakened by, as Raid said, endless bombing since January 1991, and it was bombed every day, not once in a while, every day, that it was so weakened, Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld felt like, we'll go in, we'll knock them out, and then, we'll get on the Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier, say, mission accomplished, we're winning, and they'll be able to be the new conquerors of the Middle East and refashion it according to American designs, a new sort of Pax Americana where 2/3 of the world's oil is. That was a plan that only succeeded in creating human misery and suffering, and clearly, as we can see, not only Iraq, but the entire region has been devastated. I would say that we have to go into the streets confident that in spite of the fact that they have gotten away with many, many wars, that we, the people, the people's movement, do have the possibility of making great change. If we don't do it, if we don't believe it, it won't happen. If we wait for the Democrats or politicians who make better decisions or better policies, we can be certain that the policy and orientation and actions of imperialism will go unchecked. So we have to only look at ourselves, have confidence in ourselves, and know, as Raid said, if you want to stop the Islamic State, stop dropping bombs on Iraq. Stop torturing Iraqi people. Stop occupying other people's countries. The United States cannot say legitimately, morally, legally, that now that they have created the Islamic State, that they have a legal or moral rationale to begin endless war against Iraq or Syria or anyone in the name of fighting another arm of extremism. Thank you very much. See you tomorrow.